Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining. We've actually had a really good showing on the registrations. There was actually up to 170. So I'll wait till the numbers grow a little bit more in the room until I start properly. Yeah, thanks again for joining on this really sunny day. It's sunny in London. I've heard it's sunny in Manchester, so hope it's sunny where you are. Just when we were doing our back chat, we were kind of hoping someone was going to watch in the garden. So if you're not doing already and can do, why not take your phone or laptop into the garden if at all possible, or park, or wherever you might be. Oh, nice to hear it's also sunny in Kent. Good morning and hi to everyone who's putting your messages into the chat. As I will say, I hope the chat gets used a lot today. We like people to put their comments and their questions into the chat. And so yeah, if you can help us to stimulate the discussion as we go, that's excellent. Sunny in Cheshire too. Sorry to hear, Eric, it is gloomy in Toronto, but nice to hear we've got a very long distance visitor here. Where else do we have? Annie also in London. Awesome. Mississippi. Nice one, Tina. Thank you. Glad to hear that. Everly saying Midlands are bright. Good. Red car bright from Christy. Cool. We've got Orkney. We've got New York City. This is cool. We got Netherlands. We got Cardiff. We got New Zealand. I've never done this whole thing of asking people where they're from before. I always thought we had a lot more people just from the UK, but this is awesome. Sunny in Walthamstow. So you're about, yeah, I'm calling from Homerton in Hackney. So I guess I'm about half an hour on the bike. So indeed, sunny where we are here. Nice to hear it's sunny in Milan, Cosimo. I was also quite worried I'd not have anything to talk about while I was waiting for him to get into the room, but I'm talking about where all of you are from, so this is cool. Philly Morris from Cornwall, nice to see it sunny, thank you for letting us know too. And James from Curacao might be winning so far. Wendy's sunny in St Albans, thank you very much. And Julie, hi from Cardiff, hope it's sunny in Cardiff too. Sunny in Salford, I'm hearing. And Felipe, sunny in London, lovely. So it looks like we've got quite a large crowd in the room. So I think I will start. Say thank you very much all for joining us. Seems all but one of you have absolutely loads of sunshine. So thank you very much for taking this time out to come and listen. So today it's our deep dive into after parties. So we've got three wonderful experts here. We've got Giulia, we've got Karenza, we've got Lisa. I won't do the proper introductions yet. So the format will be, first I will get Karenza to do her opening gambit. I think you said 10-15 minutes-ish. Then Lisa, then Giulia. I will do the proper introductions at that point. And then following on from that, from their kind of opening speeches, I'm hoping it gets to be quite a bit of a discussion. And so that works best if you use the chat and if you use the Q&A, chuck your questions in there. And then I will chuck them back at the expert guests. If it's a really brilliantly well-timed question, sometimes I might even be rude enough to interrupt the speaker and say, can you ask this one since it's just perfect? But most of all, I chuck them in at the end for a bit of a discussion. And sometimes the guests might even want to reply through typing, put in details, anything like that. And when people at home can help by giving us relevant information, linking us to good papers, YouTubes, films that are relevant to what we're talking about, that's all the better too. So again, I've said all my thank yous. So I think we might as well get going. So Karenza, thank you very much for joining us. Very nice to meet you too.
Yes.
And so please take away, tell us about after parties, tell us about your research on after parties. And yeah, thank you very much and take it away.
Thank you very much, James. So yeah, first of all, thanks for inviting me and organising all this, and also thanks to everyone coming, as we've said, on this lovely sunny day. Today, obviously, we're talking about afters or after parties. So my presentation is just going to say a little bit about, for example, where after parties might sit in the study of parties and drug use at parties more generally. And then we'll talk a little bit about definitions. It's something that when we've been kind of grappling with what exactly is an after party. And then some of the challenges of studying drug use in particular in these kind of spaces. And then some maybe kind of ideas sort of going forward about how we might be able to study this particular phenomenon. So the first thing to say, I guess, is that, you know, by dint of being within a kind of private domestic space, after parties or parties more generally, but particularly after parties are quite hidden. And they can be, or they can get to be, quite messy, I guess, if we want to put it like that. Partly because people are in a private space. And I think, as I'm going to say in a second, that's one of the reasons studying after parties is a little bit different to, for example, looking at drug use in the nighttime economy. So I said about the difficulty of defining after party. Well, you would have just thought it'd be easy, and I've kind of said it's a, you know, it's a post event. Normally a clubbing event, a music event, maybe a festival. So it's a post-event party. And you could say it's a kind of type of party as well. And that subtype of party involves certain specific practices, and that's what we're interested in. So a post-main event party, either in your own home or someone else's home. So space is very important. Also, it's typically the kind of at the end of a night out, or what we might call a big night out. It might be a kind of penultimate part of the night out, as in something might happen after the after party. But generally speaking, it is kind of the final end point. The other thing that's really important is sociability. So friendships, meeting new people who are kind of introduced to the party group. So sociability is really important as well. And when we're thinking about what an after party is, we might be thinking about obviously the kind of technologies that are used, and that might include drugs, and the idea of an after party being a kind of space for both extending a night out and of prolonged drug use, polydrug use particularly, in that space and time. So you can see, I guess, from this that after parties has got a very kind of contested definition. And Lisa is going to furnish us with some brilliant empirical data that kind of starts engaging with this idea of a contested definition. And the other thing to say here is these three aspects, the space, the time, and the sociability, and then also to a maybe lesser extent, the technologies can help us kind of understand what's going on, I guess, in relation to after parties. Okay, so when we were talking about what is an after party, one of the things that we were saying is, okay, so obviously in a relational sort of binary way, you've got after parties and then you've got something that's not an after party. And we had that kind of fun thinking about some of these issues. So we could say that an after party, because it's a certain type of party, you know, it's not a dinner party, it's not a sex party. I'm going to talk a bit about chemsex in a second, but so it's kind of helpful to think about what an after party isn't. Also, people that go to after parties have their own kind of ideas about what they are. So if you can see this, this is from Ketflix and Pills, saying, you know, we're on this kind of bender, I guess, day 23, I'm not quite sure that's true, but the people at the bottom, the comments say, well, we were going for 6 days straight, and that's definitely something that I've recognised. So yeah, it's interesting to think about what do participants of after parties themselves kind of define as a party, and quite interestingly, some of that's around the drugs that are used. So there's this kind of idea that whilst alcohol might be present, an after party typically also involves other types of substances other than alcohol and tobacco. There might, I mean, there's also after hours clubs, and interestingly, I mean, I think the scene in terms of club scene after hours has kind of fallen away a little bit, but there are still some spaces that are obviously open after the main event. So we could say that after hours clubs or after hours spaces that are commercial or, you know, in semi-public in some way are actually different to after parties in a domestic space. And then you get these kind of glitzy film awards, you know, that kind of thing. And they call the event after the awards, the after party. And I think, I mean, I'd like to argue that that isn't what we're talking about today. Okay, so lots of text, but this is just to try and give you a flavour of why after parties haven't been looked at. I've been really wanting to talk about after parties for a long time, and I'll say a bit in a second about why it's not necessarily been possible. But there's also other issues around the kind of tradition, I suppose, within sociological, criminological drug research of looking at more visible youth cultures. And I've, you know, obviously been involved in work like that myself as well. Public and semi-public spaces tend to dominate. So if you think about the huge body of work that we've got about nighttime economies, festivals, you know, amazing work on holiday resorts as well, but a lot of that does focus on the kind of visible public spaces as well. When you get media discourse, I guess, around concerns about public safety, and this is particularly gendered and classed, it tends to be the kind of visible intoxication in public space. And rightly so, I guess we do a lot of work around harm reduction, you know, in situ, and that's really important. So the kind of public nature of a lot of drug taking, and also the concern about drug taking tends to be in more public spaces. There is also a kind of, I guess, an emergent or a tradition of looking at some of the social harms of nighttime economies, particularly what I would say a mainstream kind of alcohol-focused space, partly because of that, the perhaps more kind of scene-based phenomenon like after parties that are related to dance music cultures particularly, and other kind of aspects of dancing together, which I know Giulia is going to talk about, have been a bit obscured by this kind of focus. We've also had obviously work around alcohol use at home, and there's a kind of growing body of work about pre-drinking, and then some other work around domestic violence, for example, in the home as related to alcohol. And then also around problem drug users, and, you know, for example, trying to keep people safe within the home if they're injecting drug users. So there's this kind of risk harm framework, which I did kind of want to avoid, really, I guess. And one of the ways that we can do that, to sort of draw on that thinking about after parties, is looking at some of the critical literature on the chemsex scene. So there's a great paper by Jamie Hakam about the chemsex scene that I think is kind of a nice inspiration for the way we might look at after parties, but in a critical manner as well. So I was looking back at my work and, you know, thinking about, well, you know, if there's after parties going on, where have they been in my work? And I think if you guys probably look back at some of your work you're doing, if you're obviously looking at drugs, and there probably is stuff around afters there, but it's not always you know, put to the fore. So particularly around ketamine, because ketamine does seem to be a popular after party drug. So I sort of went back in the day, I was, you know, a long time ago now, looking at ketamine use in the UK, and pretty much all the respondents that we spoke to in 2008 talked about using ketamine in after party spaces. So, you know, really interesting. And this still applies to a certain extent. I mean, ketamine use, MDMA and ketamine use particularly popular in the Northwest where I am, also the, you know, the whole of the UK amongst young people. And that's one space where ketamine does get used in public spaces, but also at afters as well. So I suppose, like, why now thinking about afters, you know, why look at it now? I think that the stay-at-home rules, you know, really made everyone think about the home space. You know, what you know, thinking about a safe space. Is your home a safe space? Thinking a lot more about what we do in the domestic space for leisure as well. It was interesting during lockdown, obviously there was the closure of youth leisure spaces, and when we were doing some work with kind of maybe more marginalised young people around their drug use, there was a kind of particular focus on just how there was no leisure spaces available to young people, particularly more working class young people. And there was the other issue, of course, of not having a main event to go to that you then had an afters. So, you know, it wasn't an afters if you didn't have the main event. And that's one aspect, I guess, of afters is, you know, although it's a type of party, it's situated in a certain kind of time as well. So I mentioned we were looking at liminal leisure spaces, and one of the things ideas I quite like around afters is this idea that they're kind of in the middle. So they're sort of part of a big night out, but they're also the space where people kind of obviously relax and wind down to then get back into everyday life after their weekend comes to an end. So that's kind of important as well. I couldn't do my presentation without mentioning Partygate, obviously. So I don't know about you, but I remember thinking that's definitely not an afters, cheese and wine parties. So yeah, that's another thing that's kind of brought parties to the fore. And then perhaps more seriously, I think this is interesting image from the new UK drug strategy. And again, I'm sure you kind of heard about this kind of idea of a crackdown on recreational drug users as well, and the spaces that they frequent. Okay, so one of the reasons I decided to start looking at after parties and thinking about them, particularly over the pandemic, is changes in the kind of distance, kind of the proximal or the distance to the research topic. So I spent 10, 15 years or so at go to after parties. In 2014, I developed a dependency on benzodiazepines, and that basically put an end to going to afters, well, going to clubbing in more generally. And I think once I'd stopped and looked back, I kind of started to think about, actually, after parties are kind of crazy, really, and it's something so interesting that we need to be thinking about. So the reason of sort of why now, at least for me, is a bit of a distance from the research topic. So I've got a lot of autoethnographic material, and particularly diaries. The other thing that's been really helpful is Enkoff and Judith Aldrich's notion of digital traces as well. That's been kind of helpful in thinking about, you know, where's the afters and where can we gather material about afters. Also, I'm very interested in targeted population surveys and what they can tell us about the spaces that people take drugs in and the kind of drugs they take in those spaces. And then finally got some funding for a project called Safer Partying, that's going to use focus groups with young people, but friendship groups to talk to them about their after partying, and an online survey as well. So very excited about that. So I kind of mentioned about the reason I stopped after partying, and I think that it probably links directly to some of the kind of ethical and practical challenges around after partying and studying after partying. So having a kind of partial insider positionality is obviously important to be able to access these spaces, but in a sense that also puts the researcher in a kind of risky space, really. Also thinking about what we might call dangerous knowledge production, you know, being in those spaces, also being a witness to illegal behaviours as well. So that's also a really important thing to think about. So linking to the kind of sensationalism and the stigma and the criminalisation of recreational drug use generally, obviously, but recreational drug use can be really problematic. I mentioned some of the more kind of practical aspects. So after party, it's access is invite only. So obviously it's not like going along to a festival to do some research where you can buy a ticket or you can get access from the stakeholders that are putting on an event. So that's one of the reasons it can be quite difficult. If you're not in an after party scene, it would be hard to do a participant observation, for example, and it can be exhausting, and there's a certain toll on researchers as well. I've had fun engaging with ethics committees over the years, more generally anyway, and some of their assumptions about people in these spaces taking drugs means that those people are out of control. And I guess obviously as drug researchers, we know that that's not generally the case. So having to make that argument or argue against that perception is important. And more generally, it's hard to make the familiar strange, I guess. If something that you're used to, it's hard to make sense. The interesting thing about after parties is they're quite strange, and some of the digital traces, some of the images and representations of them are quite fun. So a couple of examples here. This relates to the temporal aspect. You know, this idea of a lost weekend, you know, having so much fun that you can't quite remember what happened. Like my parents say about the 60s. So there is that element of them. There's an identity element as well. So I love this hoodie. I haven't actually got it, but I think that's great. You know, the idea of a party identity. And also the idea of the world of afters being quite strange. And I think Lisa's probably going to say a bit more about that. So what do we know about drug use at after parties? I mean, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? At the end of the day, people are out on a big night out. If they're taking stimulants, then that involves wakefulness, and it's not, you know, the drugs aren't just going to wear off as soon as you get home. So the wakefulness aspect is important. And we obviously know about drug use at afters from various different kinds of data, but prevalence data in terms of capturing how much drug use there is at afters is just, you know, really, really difficult. So maybe a couple of proxy measures. General population survey data that we know that 16 to 24-year-olds that go out to nightclub spaces are more likely to take drugs, including stimulants. So, you know, we can probably make the assumption that that use moves into spaces after in the main event. There's also some in situ targeted population surveys, and Fiona and I did some a couple of years ago, thinking about what people were planning to take towards the end of their night. That's another way. And then obviously the fantastic global drug survey as well, that's got some questions over the years about space. So just to finish, I guess, thinking about how could we study after parties? And I think there's actually loads of amazing tools within the drug research literature, drug research communities. We've always had a concern with space and time. And so in a sense, you know, after parties are a continuation of that, and we can use that as a framework. So I mentioned about space, time and sociability or sociality. And, you know, that these are kind of celebratory events to a certain extent. So they're ways that we can understand what goes on at parties as well. And this kind of playful aspect of after parties, you know, having fun with mates, dressing up with weird outfits or whatever, it's always been part of raving and clubbing cultures. So I see that in that context. There's also the role of humour and stories as well. After parties, lots of stories get told during the party, and then obviously stories about the party after the party. So that's another way we can look at after parties. And I've also mentioned about the fantastic work that's done around kind of chemsex parties, but the more critical aspect that can help us pathologise, avoid pathologising some of this material. This is the sociologist in me. So I think one of the nice ways we can think about afters is all the technologies. So if we think of drugs as technologies, that's one way we can understand it. But we've also got music technologies that are central, social media technologies as well. Showed you a couple of images from Ketflix and Pills, which was really popular at one time. So that's, you know, music preference particularly, and music is very central to the after party experience, and that's important to capture. So we can use some of the kind of new and emergent theories, I guess, concepts and theories that we've seen come out of drug research to try and understand after parties, and for example, drug assemblage. And then we've got now a novel concern with drug use at home more generally, and material cultures, which Lisa's been looking at. And then finally, thinking about harm reduction, ethics of care, and making sure that there are harm reduction messages that might be of relevance to after party goers. Okay, thanks guys, cheers.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Karenza. I'm actually going to bring a couple of points back to you, as we had a couple of good points, questions in the chat that relate. So one which I'll half answer, and then I'll get you to confirm or deny whether I've said if it's all true. And then after that, I've got a question related to a point you made. So think Tina, calling from the States, said, how do people get ketamine? Since she said in the States it's mainly a prescription thing. I mean, I would say here it's something that's part of the party repertoire of drugs. So when people are buying their cocaine or their MDMA, there's a good chance the same person or someone from the same circles will be selling it just in the same way. And secondly, Christiana Bevrena, very nice to hear from you again, Christiana, veteran of the ESSD conferences, asked what Karenza was meaning by dangerous knowledge. If you can go back and give us a little bit more on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christiana. So I mean, I thinking about a paper that I wrote in 2012. It was about GBL, which is a popular drug that's used in the kind of chemsex scene. And one of the things that I talked about in that paper was the idea that when we're talking about drugs, and this comes out a little bit in the work around chemsex more generally, we're kind of producing a social problem to a certain extent. Okay, so we're kind of producing knowledge around a particular issue, and we have to be really careful not to kind of pathologize that kind of activities, you know, that social group are doing. So that's why I'm really keen on the work around chemsex that kind of queers chemsex parties, because it comes from a much more critical stance than a kind of pathologizing sort of public health stance, I guess. So I guess it's the responsibility that we have as, well, how I see it anyway, responsibility that we have as researchers to be reflective about the kind of knowledge that we're producing. I hope that helps. So I think it's dangerous. I just like the word dangerous as well. Thank you.
Cool, thank you very much, Karenza. And yeah, I also do like the word dangerous for all of those clarifications. And so now we'll move on to Lisa. So again, thank you very much for joining, Lisa. Very nice to meet you. So yeah, please do tell us a little bit about yourself, and then please go and tell us about your research. Just say when we were kind of chatting on the email before about the various topics and themes that might go in today, you said that one of the aspects of after party harms and dangers that you've looked at is the need to sometimes clear out unwanted strangers and randoms from the latter stages of an after party, which I thought is an excellent thought place to go and something that's probably not considered enough. But whether or not you have that in your presentation, thank you very much. And yeah, please tell us about your work, Lisa. I think you're still muted, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm not teaching, so I'm not used to Zoom. Right, can you hear me now? Great. Thanks, James, for inviting me, and for Karenza for putting me forward for this as well. And thanks, Karenza, for setting up what I'm about to talk about in my presentation today. So I'm looking at recreational drug taking in the home, and I'm going to present today some data from a really kind of small scale study, an unfunded study that I started, well, I proposed pre-COVID. I'd kind of been thinking, like, it's interesting to understand what drug taking happens in the home and where people store drugs is what I was particularly interested in as well. But then COVID put a stop to all of that because I couldn't go into people's homes. And then who knew that COVID was going to kind of make things change a bit, and people are having kitchen discos and taking drugs at home during COVID. So it's becoming a kind of really interesting topic. So I've collected the data for my project between July 2021 and Feb 2022. So it's very recent. I've just finished data collection. And the methods I've used, I've adapted what's called an object interview method. So the object of interest in my research, or when I was doing my interviews, was a container in which people store their drugs in. So this really formed the focus of the interviews with participants. And then we used that to, as a way in to talk about their recreational drug taking at home. You'll see I've also collected visual data as well, so used photography, and I've taken photos of where people stash their drugs, either in containers, and then where they keep those containers as well, and also what's actually in those containers. So I'm not going to be presenting that data today, but just to give you a flavour of the kind of images I've been taking, collecting. This picture here is from a participant called Cecile, who features quite a bit in my presentation today, and she stores her drugs in what she calls her David Bowie bag in the top drawer of a chest of drawers in her home, well, up in a spare room in her home. And at the after party, often people say, where's the Bowie bag? Where's the Bowie bag? So it comes out at the after party. Now, my sampling strategy was purposive. I used a snowball and peer referral technique. So through my social networks, I asked recreational drug takers to recommend participants to me. I limited them to 2 referrals each so that I could create a diverse sample. And as the sample grew, I started to kind of shape that sample. I asked for people with certain characteristics, for instance, you know, from certain age categories. You know, I realized I was getting older people, so I looked for some younger people, or I realized I was having too many females, so I asked for some more males. For some reason, my slideshow is moving on before I've had a chance. Hold on, sorry about that. And so in terms of the sample, I've ended up with 5 females, 5 males. The age range is 28 to 58. The average age of my sample is 42. 6 of them were parents. 8 of them, 8 out of 10 of them lived in the northwest of England. So I've generated a lot of interview data and a lot of visual data, and I've not yet fully analysed it. So what I'm presenting today is the result of my initial analysis of interviews, and particularly focusing on after parties. So I've not looked at everything else that people do in terms of recreational drug taking in the home. And I still have a couple of interviews to be transcribed. And you'll notice that a couple of participants feature quite a lot in this presentation. So, you know, I expect that when I publish this data, you know, some of these findings may change a little. And in presenting my analysis, I've drawn on some of the concepts that Karenza's already touched on in her presentation, so particularly spatiality, sociability, and temporality. And it just goes to say, obviously, I've got a small sample, so I'm not trying to claim anything about representativeness of the data in terms of after parties. The drugs consumed, the way the parties are organised, and the way they play out for my participants will likely be different for other people. But I do think my data can help us kind of gain some insights into this under-researched area and, you know, think about future directions for research. So, defining after parties. Karenza's already highlighted some of the challenges, so I'll just go over a couple that I wanted to kind of discuss. But first of all, I just want to say that all of my sample talked of going to house parties or after parties in people's homes or private spaces. But 4 interviewees talked of hosting after parties in their home, and one of them, Cecile, was doing so regularly every 2 to 3 months and had been doing so for about 5 years. And her partner was a DJ, so she was involved in the clubbing scene. Now, there are similarities between what happens at house parties and after parties. Both involve music, dancing, drug taking, and alcohol consumption over a prolonged period in a private domestic space. So when we're thinking about defining after parties, we might want to think about whether the size of them is important. So Cecile talked about her most recent after party, which had around about 40 people attending it. Yet Jessica, another participant, talked about how her after parties have become much smaller and more intimate as she grew older, and now involved about 4 people, 4 close friends. So it got me thinking, really, what would be the lowest number for a gathering to be defined as an after party? Are 2 people playing music, dancing, drug taking, and drinking at home after clubbing at an after party? And that's something we might want to think about in future research. And in defining what is an after party, is it important to consider who attends? Jessica talked about her after parties being with, sorry about this, with trusted friends, whereas others talked of after parties including friends, acquaintances, and strangers. So I'm going to move on to have a look at some of the data from my participants, and they discussed how after parties were organised and what happens at them. So after parties could be both planned or unplanned spontaneous events. For planned after parties, there was some degree of preparation involved. So Cecile talked about, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to stop this from moving forward. It's annoying me. Sorry, hold on. There we go. So Cecile talked about how she prepared for after parties by purchasing alcohol for her guests. She cleared her downstairs rooms of all children's toys. She set up the DJ decks and she organised childcare, as she says here. So she said, I usually take the kids to my partner's parents, so they're away overnight, and I know we don't have to go and get them usually until the following night. Others talked of parties that were hosted as spontaneous, unplanned events. One participant discussed how her and her neighbours were at a club event when COVID restrictions had recently been lifted, and they all returned to their homes around the same time for an after party across 3 houses. So she says it was just everyone in and out of each other's houses. I mean, honestly, it was mental, but it was because this event at the shed, because there was 3 households from here that went, between us all, we knew nearly everyone there. And when we think about organising after parties, Cecile and Lou talked about how when they go to club events, that people would come to the after parties who were at the events, but also people that weren't at that event, at the pre-after party event, would find out about it and turn up too. And Cecile said she didn't mind this as long as people could vouch for them. But Lou said, you know, well, they both said it was kind of a word of mouth, how people find out about after parties. So let's move on to think about the substances used. So the illegal drugs participants discussed commonly being consumed at after parties were cocaine, ketamine, cannabis, and ecstasy as well, drugs that are commonly used in club scenes, especially cocaine and ecstasy. So referring to when he used to go to drum and bass nights at which he took ecstasy, Ralph said, you know, he'd go back to an after party and get back and open up a bag or 2 of Chang. Drugs that are less commonly associated with club settings are Valium. So, you know, Jessica here was saying how, you know, people used to take Valium at after parties that she went to. And alcohol was also at after parties as well. Cecile was talking about, you know, all the different drinks here that she used to kind of drink at her after parties, from cocktails to red wine and to breakfast cocktails as well. But in contrast to Cecile, some of my participants also talked about, you know, how they loved having a cup of tea at an after party. So Jessica discussed how taking different drugs at an after party fulfilled different functions. So, for instance, cocaine provided energy for the party and for chatting. She said it stimulates you, so you feel like, so you're less tired. And Valium facilitated coming down from stimulant drugs and aided sleep. So she said, you know, you're thinking, right, okay, we're not quite feeling like we want to go to bed yet. And then you take a Valium and that kind of brings you down. And then you see the other person's eyes go and you're like, right, we're ready to go to bed now. As Karenza's noted, after parties are places of polysubstance use, and this was the case for the participants who attended or hosted them. They typically took cocaine, ketamine and or ecstasy, cannabis and or alcohol. So Jessica talked of how taking a bump of ketamine managed the effects she felt after taking too much coke. As she says, it makes me feel a little bit sillier, makes me a little bit more relaxed and lucid. And in talking about their substance use after parties, participants emphasised it as something that was pleasurable. So here Jessica notes how taking cocaine and ketamine feels nice. The participants discussed how taking drugs at after parties was more open compared to public spaces like clubs. So Cecile discussed this in reference to concerns about being caught in a club. So she talks about how you know, there's a worry that you might get kicked out, you might get arrested because you're in a club, and there's always that danger, but you don't have that at after parties. And Jessica described how taking cocaine in a club meant that, you know, you had to do this in the toilet and involved waiting for a cubicle to become free. In contrast, she presents open drug taking at after parties as pleasurable and communal, creating a sense of togetherness. As she says, that for me is the joy of the afters in the home, is that it becomes more open because you're in your private space. There's a plate with lines of cocaine that's being passed around and everybody is having a bit of it. There's a potential for the frequency of drug taking and therefore the overall quantity of drugs consumed per a drug taking episode to increase at after parties. Because alcohol is expensive in clubs, smoking is banned in the UK in clubs and in many places around the world as well. And taking powder-based drugs like cocaine can be challenging. So after parties may increase substance consumption and the frequency of dosing compared to club settings. And Rory here talks about how he smoked more cannabis at after parties. So he says, you know, post-clubbing, I've been taking Class A's, then I would smoke more joints. The after-party space was also important when participants discussed their drug-taking preferences. So Cecile here explained how she preferred taking ketamine after parties rather than in a club setting. So she's saying, I've been in this kitchen before at an after party and I've thought, I've been falling through the floor. And it's not scared me because I know I'm in my kitchen and I'm holding on to it. I've got my I've got my arm in someone's arm, you know. Yeah, I'm okay because I know my surroundings. So familiarity with the home and with friends was important for feeling safe when taking drugs that can, as Cecile described to me, make you feel wonky. And in the absence of familiarity with the space, friends were important for making people feel safe when taking drugs like ketamine. So altered states of reality, you know, at after parties could be experienced in a kind of safe environment. So here Rory's describing how he felt after he takes what he calls party lines, a line combining ketamine, cocaine and MDMA with friends at an after party. So saying they're just laughing their heads off, realizing that they were in some kind of like parallel universe in different dimensions. He felt like Christ the Redeemer, while his friend, he perceived her as, you know, the size of a key ring or something. And he's just getting things out of scale, coming in and out of different dimensions and getting joy and pleasure from that. After parties can also be understood as organised spaces facilitating sociability among attendees. So playing music allows people who want to continue to dance to do so, whilst other spaces at an after party are places for chatting and chilling out, as Cecile explains here. So she has people playing on the decks, and then people are split between different rooms in her house, like people chatting in the kitchen, a few people dancing in the middle room, and then in the front room there's more people just chilling and chatting. Whoops. And talking to others at after parties presented as a pleasurable experience. So Ralph says, you know, I love all that kind of stuff, talking to people at after parties. And Jessica said, everybody's a stand-up comedian and you get to listen to people's funny stories. You know, sometimes hearing Tamsin's stories for the 150th time, but I enjoy it every time. Undoubtedly, compared to clubs, it's easier to chat with someone at an after party than it is in a club, which usually involves, you know, shouting in someone's ear. After parties exist within a specific temporality as well. So, you know, as Karenza was saying, they're kind of that next phase of the big night out. And if we're thinking about defining what they are, what has happened before might help us as well, which Karenza was discussing. So here Ralph kind of saying, you know, he doesn't define when he's been out drinking with friends and then going back and taking Coke with them, it's not an after party. So we, you know, is it an after party only if you've attended a club or music event beforehand? And after parties ebb and flow as well. So Cecile describes here the ebb and flow of her most recent after party. You know, people turned up throughout the night, which included friends who were at an after party at another house just down the road. And the majority left around 4 to 5 a.m. And it finally ended at 12 midday the next day. Participants also talked about not wanting after parties to end, and that there were always people who would stay as long as they could, or strategies would be used to keep the party going. So here Cecile's talking about, how people would order more Coke to keep the party going, and they'd all have to kind of chip in, who's got a fiver to chip in towards the communal Coke for the party. And Ralph here recalled how they used to try to extend a regular after party for as long as they could. So the windows were wooden slats and they were curtains, so you just close the slats and nothing came in. And he goes on to say, because as soon as people saw daylight, everyone, would just want to go home. After parties, however, do finally have to come to an end. And as Jessica notes, the lines of cocaine get lower and lower, well, the resources get lower and lower, the lines get thinner and thinner. And as Cecile says, the party's over when the drugs run out or people fall asleep. Whoops, sorry. So some concluding thoughts. My findings then raise questions for how we define and categorise after parties. I guess there's no one-size-fits-all definition. The findings suggest future directions for researching after parties and understanding the subjective meanings and nature of them. So we might want to be thinking about, how they're kind of organised, and if they're very much organised or they're spontaneous events. Are they small and intimate, or they can be both this, and they can be large and more party-like. They're safe spaces with trusted friends, or they could be large gatherings with, friends, acquaintances and strangers. They can involve chilling and chatting, as well as dancing and funny experiences. And they can entail taking stimulant drugs to keep the party going, as well as drugs to aid winding down. After parties may be sites of pleasure as well. So Turner 2012 suggested this in relation to community festivals. I'm not talking about music festivals here, but that idea of collective joy, it was applied to community festivals, and I think it could be applied to after parties as well. And we might want to think about the reciprocal relationship between after parties and substance use. So illegal and legal substances facilitate after parties, and after parties facilitate continual and prolonged substance use. And the openness of drug taking at and the temporality of after parties may mean there's potential for a broader range of drugs to be consumed than in public or club settings. For example, I've said it's not typical to consume Valium in clubs, and that dosing may be more frequent, resulting in large quantities consumed over time. And the concepts of spatiality, sociability and temporality can be useful for helping us to understand the nature of after parties. Okay, I will stop my share.
Thank you very, very much for that, Lisa. I do have some questions on the tip of my tongue, but I think I will wait for them until we get to the all-person joint discussion. So now I will welcome in Giulia. So Giulia, thank you very much for joining us. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
So Giulia, tell us about your work with people and dance floors. Tell us about your research. And please tell us what you've got to tell.
Thank you. I'm just trying to work out the slide sharing because I normally use Teams rather than Zoom. So I'm a bit like, oh my God, what's going on? Let's see. Right. Can you see my slides? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I guess these are very much afterthoughts on after parties, because after parties are really they're not necessarily the key kind of focus of the research that I've done through the People and Dancefloors project. So I'm going to say a little bit about the People and Dancefloors project, and then I'm going to talk about my afterthoughts about after parties. So yeah, I'm Giulia Zampini, by the way, and I lead the People and Dancefloors project, though I'm not alone. I have some lovely, lovely research partners. I think one of them is here in the audience. To start with, I guess the People and Dancefloors project started with the aim to kind of center the narratives of people who use drugs in relation to Dancefloors. So it's about exploring the relationship between people, Dancefloors and drugs, but doing it in a way that really puts the narratives of people center stage. So initially, we started the project in the UK, and we tried to collect data, collate the information, and we put it into a film to make those narratives directly accessible to people who were listening, watching, and kind of relating to the people that were on the screen. So I guess the broader objectives of the project are to embed user narratives into both public debates and policy debates. Very ambitious, I know. Disrupting harmful silences and discourses around recreational drug use, and advocate for harm reduction, but from the point of view of situated knowledge or situated knowledges. So rather than, what Karenza was saying, the kind of medicalizing, pathologizing, moralizing, starting from recognizing that peers and drug users have a lot of experiential knowledge that is very worthy and useful, and therefore should be centered in these discussions. And we try to disseminate and engage in sort of multimedia forms. So I mentioned the film. We also try to do kind of podcasts and other things that we hope might have a broader audience compared to maybe more traditional academic outputs. And we're also constantly seeking collaborations, both in the UK and internationally. And of course, we try to do this because we want change. So again, very ambitious, I know, but gotta try. So I've mentioned there's a team of us. There's other people that I work with. And more recently, I've also started working with people in both Malta and Brazil. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the research that is coming out of those two sites, although it's very preliminary. And here we've got a kind of timeline / progression of things. So the project was designed as a participatory action research project, and it started in late 2018. Most of the data collection in the UK happened in 2019. And then we did some sort of workshops to define the kind of scope and kind of questions that we wanted to ask participants. We kind of tried to build a social media platform. We did some filming. So as I said, we use film as the main kind of the main output of the first bit of the project. And so we put this kind of short documentary film together. We screened it with participants. We got their feedback and reviews. We made some changes, and then we started kind of screening it more. Well, we tried to actually screen it. We tried to do public screenings, but then COVID happened. So we had to pivot towards online engagement and try to build kind of more online discussions. We tried to do online screenings and webinars. They were like, meh. And so we, but the great thing about this online presence was that we essentially built some partnerships, remote partnerships internationally. So that was the great thing that came out of this kind of online, pivoting towards online. So more recently in 2021, we've conducted some fieldwork in Malta, and right now currently conducting some fieldwork in Brazil, which is really exciting. And yeah, so
can I stop you quickly? You're still on your first slide. So if you click slideshow and then click from current slide, and then
I'm so sorry. See, this is what happened. I don't know how to use Zoom.
Yeah, just as you're doing a normal PowerPoint in a lecture hall. So just click on the slideshow and then just move it along.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Shit. Sorry, I don't know why then.
So is it not moving then?
No, we're just seeing the first slide and the view with all the slides down there.
Oh no, I'm trying to move it, but hang on, let me try again. Is it moving?
Nope.
Resume share. Is it moving now?
Hey, we're good.
So sorry about that. You should have interrupted me earlier. So anyway, objectives, team, timeline, and here we are, participants. Okay, great. So so far we have a total of 38 individual participants spread across the 3 sites. And I mean, you can see some more kind of details of the participants in terms of kind of age bracket, ethnicity, gender split. We try to use kind of a combination of different approaches, including, well, in the UK, we did on-camera interviews. We also did audio interviews and some accepted written contributions, because all of this data collection was done for the purposes of the film, and not all participants felt comfortable going on camera talking about their drug use, which obviously would entail a revelation of their identity. In the Malta and Brazil sites, we had to stick with a more traditional qualitative research approach by maintaining anonymity and confidentiality of participants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But yeah, snowball sampling, convenience sampling through our own networks. So some of it is limited by, you know, the people we know in terms of age bracket, gender, ethnicity, and so on. But we're starting to get more variation now, not just in terms of cultures, but also in terms of variation of the sample, age, ethnicity, and gender too. In Malta, we managed to also do a focus group, which is really interesting. I was pleased actually to hear that Karenza is doing friendship groups rather than just individual interviews as part of the after parties project. Anyway, I've sort of talked a little bit about the methods. We've done some autoethnographic writing and reflections. We try to do multimedia engagement, and my plan is to do cross-cultural comparison across the 3 sites. This is some of the, you can see the website screen, our podcast, and the film trailer. And these are just some of the things that we've written as part of the project. And so now getting to the messy hidden stuff. So doing research through film and using film as a tool is quite a challenge, in part because it's quite an intrusive tool. And so therefore, you know, negotiating access, but also, you know, whether people feel comfortable actually interacting with camera or going on camera, especially talking about stigmatized, taboo, and kind of activities is a real challenge. So, you know, negotiating this was difficult, but in the context of the UK, the level of cultural accommodation of both clubs and drug use, I think, allowed to create maybe a space that was more open to research. So a lot more people were willing to go on camera to talk about their experiences. A lot more people were, I guess, interested in, and I think people are quite used to, I guess, cameras in clubs, because, you know, I think clubs are like highly mediated, but also hidden at the same time. So you got cameras all the time, sort of, you know, people flashing phones and taking photos and taking videos. But then the moment where you're actually negotiating access for research, you have to be really careful about, you know, how to do that in an unobtrusive way. So, you know, getting people's consent. So we only really went into like small clubs and then got everyone's consent to use a camera. You know, obviously didn't point cameras at people's faces and so on and so forth. Obviously, we're doing research remotely. We still would like to use film as a tool, but it's much harder because, well, obviously it's remote. People are afraid of the repercussions that their presence in the club space and their identity as drug users might have, or revealing their identity as drug users might have in terms of their work, their reputation, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be much harder to kind of negotiate and implement. But we are thinking about ways to do that, perhaps thinking about sort of getting actors to act the narratives of the people that we interact with and interview and that participate in the project. So finally, it's just my afterthoughts on after parties coming up. So whilst after parties were not a focus of the research or not a main focus of the questions that I asked participants, the memories and experiences of after parties really filtered through the narratives of participants. And I'm going to sort of combine that with my own ethnogratification at after parties. We've already, I think Karenza and Liz have done a really good job at kind of giving a really comprehensive overview of after parties. They're private spaces, they're hidden, But I think what's really important for me is that they're intimate spaces. I mean, obviously, it depends. It's on the size of the party and, you know, how many randomers might end up being there. But I think they're intimate in two ways. They're intimate because they, you know, they allow people to kind of grow their intimacy in amongst groups of friends, or and also sometimes they allow to kind of quickly grow intimacy with people that you've met on the night out. So they're, you know, they give you opportunities to extend and deepen those connections. So here I'm talking primarily about parties after club nights. So usually people attend, you know, we've heard some of the reasons: they don't want the party to end, they want to listen to usually their own choice of music, which obviously is different from what they get in clubs. They want to wind down, they want to have quality conversations, they want to have more intimacy, perhaps want to take more drugs, and maybe want to feel freer than they perhaps would in clubs and more public venues. Particularly, they want to feel freer to take drugs, maybe also want to feel less judged in their drug taking, and you know, feeling like everybody else in their group perhaps is taking the same drugs and they can do it in a way that is unhidden. And therefore that counters some of the feelings that people might experience as drug takers, you know, feelings of guilt and shame for taking drugs that are actually often being reported by participants to the People and Dancefloors project. So I'm also a big fan of Jamie Hakim's work on queering intimacies, and he talks about this contradiction between individualism and collectivity that sits at the bottom of chemsex parties or kind of sex parties that happen in the queer community. And I think a lot of these reflections apply to after parties as well. So I totally stole his work when I talk about the drug use at these parties. Drugs are used to lower inhibitions and heighten pleasurable experiences, but also to address the lost sense of collectiveness through creating spaces and practices of collective, intense, and effective intimacy. Quickly about safety, which I think is a really important aspect of both feeling safety as well as harm reduction. People might feel safer after parties because they are usually among friends or close friends. They might feel safer to do or say what they desire. And they also might feel safer because they're in a home space rather than a public space or a club. They may feel less or no judgment around their drug consumption, which can be experienced as freeing in itself, kind of relates to what I said before. At the same time, drug consumption could be less safe in terms of quantities, mixes, as well as sharing snorting equipment. So that's often things that are reported in the context of kind of recreational drug taking, club drug taking. After parties can also be a site of experimental sexual practices and experiments in polydrug use. And I think often these things are kind of tend to be pathologized or kind of medicalized in the kind of mainstream literature around chemsex. And so we should be careful of like not ending in the same in the same trap in relation to studying after parties, because we also know that harm reduction practices usually start within peer groups and are group led, and so therefore they're emergent and that they can be really good. So you can actually watch and witness the development of very good group drug cultures that may emerge in kind of after party settings. And of course, those are not generalized, but they could be specific to a particular peer group. So we can maybe learn things from those kind of practices. I think it's important as well to consider that most participants in the People and Dancefloors project cast themselves as both responsible and knowledgeable drug users, knowledgeable in their drug use. So I think that that's significant in terms of, I think, considering that that there is a good knowledge base in amongst people that usually sometimes comes from maybe rough or extreme experiences, but eventually might develop into a kind of good or safer kind of practice. And finally, a quick note about some differences between the UK versus the world. So I think the GDS reported that UK drug users take more drugs in one session compared to drug users in other countries. And I think this very much reflects the narratives from participants to the People in Dancefloors project. So there's more consistent polydrug use, and the popularity of ketamine and sometimes psychedelics is kind of present in the mix, compared to other sites where the more common polydrug use combinations was coke, alcohol, MDMA, and weed at the end of the night. And there was this really fun anecdote actually in one of the Maltese, on one of the interviews from Malta, talking about UK tourists bringing ketamine to Malta, and how ketamine was considered to be something that changed the mood on the dance floor, and therefore that was very different compared to the kind of Maltese experience of dance floors and so on. And I think this is really interesting, but what's important to consider is that I think UK drug culture can often set trends globally as well. And I think, in part because, there is a lot of traveling from the UK of DJs, of party crews, of tribes to other countries as well, festivals and so on. And so obviously they bring their own drug cultures with them. And of course, other people may learn, and there might be some kind of mishmash and kind of learning and exchange there. And of course, that learning can also happen not just through physical presence, but also through social media and kind of aesthetics and all the other kind of ways in which these kind of cultures can become global. And some conclusions. I think negotiating access to intimacy and intimate spaces is a real challenge, but is also really important, particularly when we're thinking about narrative or person-centered kind of research or research practice. I often feel the intruder. I deal with the insider outsider conundrum all the time. And obviously I'm wearing different hats, and the researcher, the punter, the drug user, and there's like, and I know the researcher has more power, but I don't want to take away from the other kind of identities and positionalities as well. In terms of after parties, I think it's really important to demystify them from liminal spaces of excess or harmful, risky spaces, towards thinking about them as kind of creative spaces, bonding sites, having important pro-social functions. And I think in that respect, it's also important to ask drug users at both clubs and after parties what safety means to them, how they feel safe, and what kinds of spaces they want to create. And I think for this purpose, we can learn a lot from the queer community, not just in terms of the chemsex research and the STS stuff, but also the practices of queer communities in and around party spaces. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much for that, Giulia. So we'll now get on to more of the discussion side. And actually, I've got one I will throw straight at you, Giulia, which then others may wish to have a bite at too afterwards. So much earlier on in the day, there's some discussion in the chat about how global and universal after parties were. We had people from someone from Ireland saying, yeah, but they're called rollover. And I think I'd heard that before, or at least being on a rollover was to be still going once the sun had come up. We heard people saying yes in Estonia and Netherlands. Then we had two correspondents from the United States saying, one saying maybe we don't have them, the other saying maybe they only happen in a kind of elitist, very rich people or very middle-class students quite a way. So first, Giulia, internationally, how universal do you think this phenomenon of people going to a bigger party and then kind of scaling down to a smaller party to keep things going? And specifically, I guess it seems to me America's a very large country of a large recreational drug taking culture. So I'd kind of be amazed if no one had thought of the idea of just taking the party to someone's house to carry on. So I wonder what you've heard specifically about America and also from the rest of the world.
So I think in the context of Brazil, for example, I've spoken to a lot of people that attend baile funk events, and in that context, after parties they don't seem to be a thing. Like it's not a thing essentially. And whereas I think in the Maltese context, for example, I think people have spoken about sort of going back to people's houses to continue the party. But I think often people kind of prefer to stay outdoors. I think in part because it's just nice weather, so they don't need to go to someone's house. They can just continue outside. And I think also, and they've spoken about the increase in parties at home or parties in someone's house as a result of COVID primarily. So of course, I think the knowledge of course is limited to the particular participants I've spoken to, as well as obviously the effects of COVID that were going on at that particular point in time when I did the interviews. But yeah, I do think it also depends on particular on sort of certain cultures related to particular music scenes as well, potentially. So that's just the hunch I have from the people that I've spoken to.
Awesome, thank you, Giulia. I don't know if Karenza or Lisa want to add anything on the international side.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So I started off with afters at home, and I just said UK and beyond, kind of vague sense. So I know a little bit in the so this is from kind of auto ethnographic stuff. So a little bit in the Netherlands, been to afters there. I wonder whether there is something about places that have got after hours clubs as well, and that provision, and whether people go to those either as well as or instead of. So I was thinking, this is obviously not international, but thinking back in the day, there used to be a lot more after hours clubs. And one of the things that Jamie Hakim says in his paper about the gay scene in London, in Vauxhall, is there used to be a lot more clubs. So one of the ideas is maybe there's a relationship between the hours that clubs are open, the kind of clubs, the range of clubs that there are. And one of the things that Jamie suggests from his kind of empirical stuff is that some people in the gay scene, at least down in London, had moved a bit more to parties because there wasn't the clubs, because of the gentrification of the area. So I wonder whether, in terms of what kinds of parties happen and where they happen might relate to even right down to the spaces in a certain part of the city, I guess, or a community. So yeah, the only place I know in terms of for sure that there's afters is in the Netherlands, and I think it's really interesting that the UK is often positioned as this. Well, it is the place where people party hardest. A lot of international DJs say that, and they want to come to the UK because we're renowned for having these amazing dance crowds. So I think it's interesting what Giulia was saying about that there's some kind of maybe something particular about the UK. So I'd be really interested. Oh, I just wanted to say as well in relation to international aspect, I don't know if anyone knows the work of Amy Penney. So I think it's about 2012, Amy published a really great paper about MDMA use amongst young people in Australia. And what she was saying is that people, though they would have afters, but they would only use MDMA in the after hours space because they were worried about the kind of bodily demeanors of what it's like when you're smashed on MDMA. You're quite noticeable. So they tended to use more stimulant, like methamphetamine, speed and stuff in the clubs, and then they would go and only use MDMA after, not ketamine, only use MDMA afters. So I can imagine there being, quite a broad variety. The only other source of data maybe around this is the Global Drug Survey, because obviously that's got a big international sample as well. So yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Karenza. Also, while you were speaking, there's some interesting points in the chat about the nature of the space around. Someone saying when they're in Devon, afters would be on the beach or in Dartmoor, but now that person is in Manchester, they're not going to hang out in a dodgy park at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is pretty interesting. I think also you in the chat, Karenza, mentioned an interesting thing about normalization and research. And I guess there's probably an element of normalization and having afters. So here's an anecdote I can remember. I was at a rave in Toronto, and there were some people there who were saying, oh, what's going on afterwards? And then I spoke to my friends and said, why don't we invite these nice people back? And they absolutely jumped out of their skin, the idea of strangers kind of finding out about what they might do at their home. So I guess maybe there is places where it's sufficiently normalized that the idea of inviting a stranger to your house for something illegal is just kind of the thing you do rather than something that people don't do, perhaps. But cool, thank you. Very, very interesting thoughts there. I don't know if Lisa, you want to say anything on the international side before I go on to my next question?
Not really. I mean, I suppose I would just add to what Karenza says is around kind of, that it depends on local policies around clubbing and things, and how long clubs are open for, and what you can do in clubs. I would think that since it's banning smoking at clubs, people might be more kind of, in public places, might be more keen to kind of get home and have a spliff and, and chill out and stuff like that, rather than being in some pokey smoking area that you have at clubs and things. So those kinds of things probably influence, when people go to afters, and even searching, like, if you're concerned about getting your drugs taken away from you, you go to the club for the music, and then you kind of start to think, I want to go home and play my own music, and go home and take some of these drugs that we didn't bring out with us. So maybe some people just take a few drugs with them and then save a lot of drugs at home for after parties. But it's not, I have no idea particularly about the what goes on internationally particularly, but those are the sort of things that I'd be interested in trying to find out. I'm sure there's a lot of cross-cultural differences.
Awesome, thank you very much. And so this is one for all of you, on whoever wants to go first. So there's a question earlier about whether there is something middle class about after parties. And so I wonder if in your experience that is something you recognise. I also wonder if perhaps in terms of us as researchers, maybe, we're researchers, we work at universities, we're somewhat middle class, at least through our profession. People we know might be too. So are these a middle class phenomenon? Perhaps do us as researchers particularly likely to find out about the middle class side of it? And so I guess we're building on those. So what do you think the nature of it is with regarding that? And maybe if we are finding out more about middle class scenes, is there ways that we can diversify and expand our knowledge? Anyone want to start on that one?
I think Lisa, do you want?
I don't mind if you want to go, Karenza, but I would just say that my sample is middle class. So, what I've found in relation to after parties is from a particular grown up sample as well, I would say. But, this is one of the ways that we need to be thinking about how to kind of access other people from different kind of social class groups, etc. And I don't know whether it's a middle class phenomenon, but I suspect it probably isn't. I mean, is clubbing a middle class phenomenon? If clubbing isn't a middle class phenomenon, then after parties are likely not to be as well, because I think after parties are just about people, they're high on stimulant drugs. They want a space to go and kind of wind down from that and, hang out with their mates. So I don't think it's a middle class phenomenon, but maybe Karenza or Giulia have some more to add to that.
Well, thanks. I have one interesting, and that was some suggestion in the chat earlier, maybe a middle class aspect is having enough space to bring people back after a club, although someone also put a bit of a riposte of their after party memories are 20 people in a tiny student flat, although student flats potentially middle class thing, maybe it debunks the size theory of that. Karenza, do you want to say something on the class aspect?
Yeah, I think this is so interesting, isn't it? So I would say the after parties definitely aren't just middle class people. And one of the reasons I know that is because I live really near Heaton Park, where Park Life is held, and Park Life has a very kind of particular, very young working class demographic, basically. And oh my goodness, that weekend is very, very noisy around my way. So I do think people have afters, working class people have afters, working class youngsters. So one of the things that a colleague and I at Sheffield Uni did was look around young people's, working class young people's leisure, mostly white working class, during lockdown, and the fact that there weren't the spaces that they normally hung out, so that they would be these liminal spaces, like under, like when you're a teenager and you hang out like under car park, around car parks and weird spaces, like in betweeny kind of space, like bus stops. Like why hang out on bus stops? So I think there is an issue around, if you can only have an after party if you've got a house, mainly if it's your own, or at least you're sharing with people that share similar interests and want to do the same thing. So quite a lot of the youngsters that we talked to for that particular project didn't have somewhere to go back to. So even if they wanted to, they didn't have anywhere, or they were living with parents. So, sometimes the parents would party too, but not, that's not typical. So I do think that working class youngsters do have afters, but I guess that's one of the issues with it, isn't it? That because we're trying to study something that we don't have access to. The other thing is age, actually. Over the years, I've had afters where we've had quite a broad age range of people, from kind of 18 to more like my age, sort of 40s and 50s. So I do think there's an age range, but the other thing is obviously to get access to certain kinds like student parties, student afters, you'd have to be, at least a similar kind of age to them and be in the same spaces. So that's why I think that we can study after parties a little bit through proxy measures if we can't have access, direct access to those spaces. So yeah, I think. Oh, and just to say as well, the thing about kept flicks and pills and the kind of images that you see, and there's talk online about afters, and a lot of that is from young people and from, I think, young people that aren't necessarily middle class, or they're not necessarily students. So I think that's another hint as well. So yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I guess to Giulia, I guess that's kind of the conversation has moved quite around our access to research populations, and that there's often an element of social similarity in the people you get to research with, if it is something ethnographic. Yes, Giulia, your research often starts on the internet, doesn't it? People finding you through People and Dancefloors. So I wonder what you found, class-wise, and I guess in a way there's a cyber filtering of your research population. So do you want to tell us?
No, it's just so dependent on my research partners, who they are, how old they are, and where they're situated, the kind of interests that they have. So everything is filtered through them as gatekeepers. So that's been the case in both sites. And so basically, it's interesting actually, because it might be quite a specific entry point, but then it's still different than what my entry point would have been, right? In terms of age, in terms of maybe particular genre, and then as well as kind of ethnicity too, because I've had a real hard time kind of accessing in the UK context, people that were beyond my existing networks. I just didn't know how. I mean, and even through kind of snowballing and stuff, it just seemed like you could guess more of the same kinds of people. So it's very hard to break through or sort of beyond that. The one thing I'd say is that there's definitely been a mixture amongst participants to the People and Dancefloors project of both middle class and working class people. Although probably middle class slightly, the number of middle class people slightly higher in the sample. And I think, the important questions in relation to the difference might also be questions around privilege, visibility, like the ability for people to stay hidden, in a kind of middle class context and scenario compared to a working class context and scenario. So I think that's maybe an important question to think about.
I think I was just going to add to that, to what Giulia is saying about so different groups of people can be more or less hidden, and it's easy for certain groups of people to be more or less hidden. So for young people of black minority groups, I think it's particularly hard. And I mean, we saw this in the pandemic. Young men, mostly in urban areas from black minority ethnic backgrounds, were subject to the highest rate of fixed penalty notice than any other group. So they tend to be much more visible when they're in visible space as well. So I think someone mentioned in the chat about certain kinds of scenes and feeling, like there's a lot of issues around grime, for example, not being allowed to be played in certain spaces, people being excluded from nighttime economy spaces. I mean, I've had this with my partner, being not let in, basically because he's Asian. So I think that all kind of plays into whether people are more likely to have house parties, even not just afters. So yeah, I think that's a really important kind of thing going on there about age, class and race and ethnicity as well.
Cool, thank you. So what I think I'll move to now is kind of sort of linked to that. So some people I think would unfairly criticize our research agenda by saying we're looking at middle class problems that aren't the biggest problems. There's people suffering a lot more out there. So why are we kind of focusing on the fun and quirky end, they might say. I think that everything should be researched, and I think if one can research it, then one should. And also, of course, in parallel, lots of research with other groups of drugs users does happen. But I want to add to that. So we've had some discussion on how some of the reasons for going to afters is perhaps avoiding harms that they might see in a more populated, for instance, clubbing area. But I wonder if you can say more about any harms that you think there might be that happen in after parties. And with that, what can be done to reduce them? One person in the chat talked about party bags being handed out with harm reduction supplies, such as condoms, lubes, and safer drug snorting equipment. So I wonder if any of you want to talk about the harm aspect, whether you hear about it in your research, and whether you've got any ideas for how to talk about the harms or how to reduce the harms possibly. So Sarah, you are up still there. So Karenza, would you like to start on that before we move across the panel?
I'll start. Just going back to I think that we're talking about recreational drug use, aren't we, typically? I mean, one of the things that over the years a lot of party people said to me is that as soon as use moves outside of the weekend or whatever party time people decide, as soon as it moves out of the weekend, I have to say this is also what happened to me. So as soon as you start, it's fine to take Valium at the end of an after party to get yourself down. Not a good idea to keep doing it the rest of the week. So talking about harms, I would say one of the harms is the possibility of people potentially developing some issues with drugs, and I think this also relates to what both Lisa and Giulia were saying about quantities. So it's just the amount of time. If you're awake for 12, 16 hours or however long it is, you are going to be taking more. There's also the relationship between the after party and kind of everyday life, having to get yourself sorted and head back on for Monday. So again, some people have kind of indicated to me over the years that they'll have a line of Coke on a Monday morning before they get the bus. And so I think that there's a possibility that some of the drug use that goes on afters, partly because they do go on for so long, could kind of bleed into everyday life. So I think that's a potential harm, maybe a more chronic issue. And then I guess it's interesting what someone was saying, I think on the chat about if you're in the public space, at festivals now, they do have fantastic harm reduction, depending on the festival, fantastic harm reduction initiatives. And obviously that you could say because you're visible, you're safer. So I think that's something that we maybe need to explore a little bit more through research. And as Giulia was saying, actually speak to people that go to afters and work out what they find helpful in terms of reducing harm. And I think that's probably the most important thing. So yeah, I'm just gonna say the kind of acute aspect of it, perhaps I'm not as interested in a sense. I think it's interesting to think about the drug use as also kind of how it shapes people's time afterwards and how it shapes their week. I mean, we've talked quite a lot about come downs and and managing the come down, managing getting enough sleep before you do go back into work or college or whatever. So I think that space is really interesting in terms of harm reduction.
Awesome, thank you. Lisa, have you got anything to add on the harm reduction side?
So with my sample, because their average age was 42, they talk about how kind of, as we know, and as I know through the research that I do, as people grow older, they become, more knowledgeable about drugs. So one of the interviewees said, we know our limits, we're sensible, that kind of thing. So even though they're taking drugs over an extended period of time, they see themselves as still being kind of, I don't really like using risk managers, but knowledgeable risk managers and knowledgeable risk takers, that kind of thing. So so, you know, the chances of harm are kind of minimized, but I agree with Karenza that, you know, drug taking can kind of seep into the rest of the week, or into part of that week, and that can perhaps be something that we need to think about. Obviously, you know, if we're taking stimulant drugs, it applies anywhere, but you know, the sharing of straws and that kind of thing may happen. And, you know, when people take drugs, they become, you know, less inhibited and makes sometimes silly decisions about taking drugs. So, you know, your inhibitions are lowered, so you might like end up taking more than you normally would, or mixing things that you wouldn't necessarily mix. So, you know, there are potential for harm at after parties. What we need to think about is how we can kind of, you know, who needs to be informed about harms, what kind of, and also think of them as safe spaces as well, which is what kind of Giulia's talking about as well. But, you know, they did, my participants talk about being with friends, you know, they're in amongst their friends. So people are looking out for each other as well. But yeah, there's potential for some harm reduction guidance somewhere along the line, I think.
I was just thinking about Liz, what you're saying, and it's about the way that the afters, I don't know, it's kind of quite a contained space. So people, you know, people that are there can kind of vouch for each other, I guess. So the relationships between the people that are there are, I think, often quite different to what you get when you're in, you know, the main event space as well. So I think there's something there going on. And I was just going to mention about ketamine, you know, as one of the kind of key after party drugs in the UK. I think, you know, its popularity does seem to be mostly within the, you know, after space. So I do think that there's something there we probably need to think a little bit about ketamine use, and then mixing as well, as you mentioned about cocaine, MD and Ket mixed together. But then there's other things like you know, dehydration. I was thinking about, you know, that thing about when's the party going to end, and I think quite a lot of people almost get too tired to end the party. It's like you can't be bothered to go to bed, you know. So there's almost like there's quite a lot there about managing, you know, just getting enough sleep. I think somebody in the chat mentioned about dropping the kids off, you know, and then having to, going, you know, finishing the party at 5 and then having to drop the kids off at 8. It's just like, oh my God. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff around the length of time as well, and how that can kind of take a kind of quite physical toll on people's bodies. So.
Yeah, and just on a positive note, I've noticed people you know, starting to use individual straws that they distribute, so that people can hold on to the straws, and so that there is no kind of sharing of that equipment. And, you know, also people will sort of started introducing kind of drinking tea, or like something that isn't alcoholic, or like what is that stuff called, like electrolytes, you know, that kind of mineral salts that you can put in the water, that's good for hydration and all that sort of thing. So that, you know, even those kind of small things, you know, they seem quite small things, but they can be you know, quite kind of, you know, countering some of the worst effects of binges. Yeah.
Oh, awesome, thank you. That's something I think it's probably quite difficult to research, you know, what is there a drip kind of lessening of one's health through this sort of over exuberance. But it's more interesting is, you know, what can we do informationally suggesting what's a good idea. So I think certainly there's probably a lot of people who haven't quite thought of the idea that kind of using the same note or straw around a room of 10 people isn't that wise. And I don't really like the idea of, you know, the electrolytes kind of sharing, you know, giving out sachets of Diarrhea, which I think is creeping up in popularity at festivals. And also there's so I've been living in Singapore before, and there's a drink there called Pokahari Sweat, and nothing makes you feel better when you're dehydrated. So I love the idea of outside clubs, people selling if they must, even better, giving away these rehydration drinks, or at least making it known like it's a good idea. Why don't you be the person at the after party saying, I'll make a big round of diuretytes so everyone can get their salt and sugar levels up so they don't kind of lose it, and so they can get make the final leg and make it home safely. So where else shall we go? So maybe I'll ask now, so please do keep on putting any of your questions in the chat. Love to see more of them there. I will ask though, what we think the direction of travel is. So we've talked about ketamine being a major thing. You know, certainly when I was at university, that's like 18 years ago now, that was a very, very major thing. So I don't, you know, I was kind of in Brighton at the time. I kind of perhaps mistakenly thought it was more Brighton centered than it actually was. So I wonder if you think, is there a big increase, you think, in ketamine? Are there any other drug trends relating to the after party scene you think that we should know about? And again, there's a couple of people asking, kind of alluded to, you know, will COVID have a long-term result in people's partying trends? So maybe you're up if you want to take the lead on this one, Giulia.
So again, sort of lots of caveats here, but one thing, and you know, go maybe to the GDS for more significant and kind of I guess broader and more valid kind of data on this. But I think in terms of trends, there's definitely I think there's just more psychedelics in some scenes, and that they're taken in small amounts, and that they're taken throughout, sort of not quite microdosing, but maybe like a quarter tab of acid or a bit of mushroom that is also in the mix of the other more traditional stimulant drugs. And there's definitely, you know, the kind of the use of ketamine. I think I feel like it's kind of it's sort of gone full circle. There was like 2007, 2008, then it sort of went again, and then it's back again now, and it's in the clubs, and it's, you know, people are just constantly taking bumps, and they're consuming ketamine. But then there's also people who just consume ketamine and balloons, for example, in the context of after parties. So it does vary from group to group and individual to individual. But I think, yeah, there's just like a polydrug use repertoire is quite specific to maybe particular scenes. Like in the trance scenes, there's always been more psychedelics, you know, compared to other scenes. And yeah, I think it will be interesting to see, you know, one thing that's resurfaced again is speed as well in certain again, you know, in relation to the kind of techno scene. I think that started, you know, it sort of began, I think, more forcefully because of an exchange between Berlin and London as well. So it seemed like there are now more people that live within Berlin and London, and I think that there is more exchange between the drug cultures of the two places. But again, that's just yeah. And yeah, somebody's saying 2CB, definitely seen more 2CB, you know, anecdotally as well. So yeah, because 2CB was always, I think, a thing at festivals, but now increasingly I see people mention it at clubs as well. So yeah.
Awesome. So Lisa or Karenza, anything to say on current future directions?
I think I agree. I think I actually agree with Giulia saying about ketamine. So when we did the research, well, it was made illegal in 2005, wasn't it, under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So when we did the stuff around ketamine and sort of found that it was mostly afters, these were mostly people in the trance scene, mostly a bit of techno, a bit of house. So I do feel like it's kind of, you know, it was really popular, and it kind of seemed to fall out of favour, maybe in the kind of binge drinking years. And then I think it's come back, and I think that's the biggest difference I've seen in relation to that ketamine use is, as Giulia says, is youngsters mostly, because techno scene is really young, quite, at least in the Northwest, and it's a dead young scene. Youngsters taking bumps, and that seems to be the kind of main trend. And one of the interesting things, I've had some conversations out, particularly in techno scene in Manchester, where young women say, well, MDMA is too much in a club. I find it too much, and ketamine is more manageable. And I think that also relates to the short acting aspect of ketamine. And then that maybe kind of speaks back to the use of psychedelics. I think somebody in the chat said about the use of psychedelics at afters. Is it that they may be too long acting? And then, so for some people, they wouldn't use a psychedelic if it was a long acting psychedelic, but then that maybe doesn't quite make sense, because quite a lot of after parties go on for ages, definitely more, 12, 16 hours. That's definitely enough time to have fun on LSD. So yeah, but I do think ketamine will continue to dominate. It's going to be interesting to see the general population, the national population data on those trends. I think there's also the other thing about the drug supply being a bit shaky post-pandemic as well. So that's going to shape perhaps what people are purchasing and what they're also getting. There was a lot of 3-MCC knocking around that was being sold as ketamine for a while in Manchester. I think that's sort of gone by the wayside now, but I do think that what drugs people are taking will relate also to the quality of what's around. I don't know much about the coke market, but I'm guessing that's also an issue. So the quality will be important. I just wanted to say as well, in terms of the safety issue, going back to harm reduction, I think we've got a real focus on harm reduction in these public spaces, and also this thing about getting home safely, which I think is really important. But I find it really interesting that it's almost like that harm reduction that we have kind of stops when someone's in a taxi, or at least as a woman, when someone texts you when you get home and you're home safe. And we have got that real idea of that, haven't we, I think. So I think that's important, and maybe why people haven't thought about drug use at afters as much, because we kind of think, oh, well, we're home now, so it's fine.
Yeah, I just want to add, thinking about ketamine, yeah, I think, that people are taking ketamine irrespective of age. I've seen it with older people that I hang out with that go to clubs and take bumps of ketamine alongside, bits of mushroom chocolate, like polydrug kind of repertoires that they have in club scenes, but just bumps of ketamine in the club scene, but then going to after parties and having, lines instead. They might be small, but they're bigger than the bumps that they're having, because, if we think about the after party environment, it's that safe environment where you can then get that little bit wonky, as Cecile said, you don't mind like falling through the kitchen floor or feeling like you are, and, having those funny experiences on ketamine can happen, more, feel that feeling of safety more in the home environment. So, yeah, I think ketamine's kind of here to stay and will be a popular after party substance. And, like Giulia said in the chat here, MDMA, the popularity of MDMA has gone down during the pandemic because people aren't going to clubs, but, I think cocaine and ketamine are, the main drugs of choice, particularly around the home for stimulant type drugs and getting alternative kind of experiences.
Awesome, thank you very much. So I'm kind of out of questions now. So if anyone has any questions, please post them in the chat very, very quickly. I don't know if anyone has a summing up or any messages they'd like to share before they go away, but this has all been really, really excellent. I think really, really educational. There has not been another webinar we've done which had such a vibrant chat. So thank you everyone who has been posting their messages into that. It's been really, really good. So I don't see anything else having landed in the chat, so I think we'll say highs and byes. So thank you very, very much to Karenza, to Lisa, to Giulia. Been really, really good. And yes, thank you to everyone else who has joined. So enjoy your Fridays and your weekend. I hope I actually have to do lots of work. I'm actually going to go and have a bike ride around the park and try and get my head sorted before I mark a load of essays, which I've been putting off all week.
Right. Get out in the sunshine. Get out in the sunshine.
I definitely will. So yeah, I'll send that as a message to everyone here. So yeah, enjoy your weekend, enjoy the sunshine. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, James. Cheers. Thank you.
James.